Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Ohioana Book Festival. We're really glad that you're joining us this year. I'm Michelle Gubola. I'm going to be the moderator for this wonderful panel about historical fiction. I want to first thank our sponsors, and you can find a list of our sponsors at the Ohioana website. With the good fortune of having our sponsors, we're able to offer the book festival always free of charge to our audience. So a big thank you for that. And also a shout out to the Ohioana official bookseller, which is the Book Loft, located in German Village, which is in downtown Columbus, Ohio. So we're grateful for their support. And you can purchase any of our authors' books at thebookloft.com. So I'll repeat that at the end of the program because I suspect you might be interested in knowing. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our 5 panelists that we'll have here today. We have Beatty, Tanya Brown, Tanya Mitchell, Jennifer Geiger, and Salvador Scabona here to talk with us about historical fiction. And it's going to be a real treat because with these authors, we are really going to go globetrotting. We're going to cover the globe and go back 2,000 years in history. So we've got people covering really all kinds of different types of history for us. So I wanted to start out with introducing all of our panelists and asking them to talk a little bit about the book that we're featuring in the book festival this year. And we'll start out with Beatty, who originally hails from Northeast Ohio. And he's been working in the book industry really his entire career. Spent quite a bit of time in publishing, worked for some publishing houses, also has done freelance editing as well as part of his career, and he's a teacher. So he's taught writing at Kent State University in Ohio, and then down at the University of Alabama, where he is currently living. So he's here to talk about his debut novel. So in addition, I'm always amazed when people have like a full career like that and they're also able to churn out a book, and a fine one he did. So his debut novel is called The Cuyahoga and has come out to rave reviews from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, you know, so little places like that reviewing this book, calling it things like deliriously funny. And I loved what one reviewer said: as comically genius as a Coen Brothers film with the narrative skill and voice of Faulkner. That's pretty good stuff, Pete. Would you please show off your book and tell us a little bit about it?
Here's the lovely book, beautiful cover, which I did not design and can take no credit for, but it is extremely cool. So yeah, thank you so much, Michelle, for hosting tonight. And thank you to Ohioana and to bookstores, especially the bookstore, the official bookstore of this, which I have spent many an hour in and gotten lost in. Actually, it's a wonderful store, and all of the booksellers of Ohio for keeping us in some reading material and helping us stay sane over the past forever, but the past year especially. So my book is a healthy mix of historical and unhistorical. I'd like to think of it as a mixture of real and unreal. But the unreality of it is in the service of some, I think, some historical points. Cuyahoga is the story of 2 brothers. One of them is named Big Son, and the other one is named Medium Son. Big Son, as you might expect from someone named Big Son, is kind of a prodigious superhero type. We meet him rescuing a widow from a burning house, and we go on to learn that he actually cleared the forests where Ohio City, the rival and sister city of Cleveland, we all know, which is actually part of Cleveland now, sits. That he tamed Lake Erie, that he met the devil, and he did all these sort of outlandish, tall tale type feats. And there's one thing he can't do, which is win the heart of Miss Chloe. And the reason why he's fixated on Chloe is because he feels like that's something that's going to make him a real person as opposed to just a hero. And the reason why he can't win Chloe in his mind is because he's broke. All of his sort of daring do and outsized feats don't pay any actual bills. So in the search of a paycheck, of an honest wage, he gets wrapped up in the rivalry between Cleveland and Ohio City, which obviously sit respectively on the east and west sides of the Cuyahoga River. And if you know a little bit about Cleveland history, you know there's a rivalry between the east and the west side of town. And it actually dates all the way back to the very, very beginning. And like a lot of rivalries, like Ohio and Michigan or Auburn and Alabama or whatever, it's the narcissism of small differences is the technical term. We tend to hate people who remind us of ourselves, I think. So the east side and the west side, which are not so different after all, still managed to get into a very bitter rivalry, which really sort of peaked or reached its most acrimonious in a real historical event that occurred in the 1830s, when an actual war broke out between the east side and the west side over the location of the first permanent bridge across the Cuyahoga. This is, if you know your Cleveland geography, where the Columbus Road Bridge is now. That war sort of reached its flashpoint in an actual day in the fall of October 1837 with knives and guns and cannons and a lot of hot air. The casualties were one cow and some scrapes and bloody noses. But it really kind of symbolized how intense this animosity was. There were bombings and sabotages and all sorts of things that happened that year. Big Son, the superhero, gets sort of drawn into this drama. And meanwhile, his brother, Medium Son, the narrator of the book, decides to help out by writing an almanac. Almanacs were at the time kind of the 1830s equivalent of fan fiction or like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was a way of commodifying these folk heroes. And I won't say too much more about the plot other than it involves a lot of explosions and mess and craziness. And it's really kind of a book that works out a lot of sort of, I had some literary ambitions of ruminating on what it means to be famous and what famous people owe us and what we owe the people we love and what love does to our insides. And it's also like some of the blurbs, but sort of a broad comedy too. And it is, in the loosest possible sense, historical. It is sort of imbued with a lot of the what I hope is a authentic or authentic-ish version of the 1830s.
Well, we'll press you more on in what way is it historical in a few moments here, but thank you for sharing the summary of that, and congratulations on the great reception the book's received. So now to Tanya Brown, who likewise is able to, I think, like hold down a full-time gig and also manage to write books in the process, which is amazing. Tanya has a master's degree in teaching and is a fourth grade teacher, which I want to just give you like a big thank you for all that you do, especially this year. You know, it couldn't have been easy to be a fourth grade teacher in the middle of COVID, and so thank you for doing that, Tanya. She's also like got some really interesting interests, and after spending some time living in Europe, has become quite interested in ancient, medieval, and sort of early modern British history. And we're going to hear about some of that in the book that she recently wrote. Why don't you show us the Queen's Almoner and tell us a little bit about it?
So this is a reimagining, so to speak, of Mary, Queen of Scots, the 16th century queen who was kind of seen as a rival of Queen Elizabeth in England. It does follow closely her life. I tried to stick as closely to the facts as I could, with, of course, the fact that the main character is a fictional character that did not exist. But I did try to stick closely to the facts of Mary's life and kind of insert this person into her narrative, imagining what it would have been like for her if she had somebody at court that was interested in helping her and helping her succeed, instead of their own ambitions and furthering themselves. If anybody knows anything about Mary Stuart, she had a very tragic life, riddled with lots of bad choices. And historians are kind of there's different sides of the fence when historians talk about Mary Stuart as to whether she was the victim of her circumstances or whether she was the perpetrator of the things that happened to her. She's been accused of being an adulterous murderer. And so there's just different views from historians as to whether she was the victim or whether she was the perpetrator. So I tried to give her somebody who would maybe help her make the decisions or help her come to the right conclusions of what decisions she should make. And of course, in the end, I could not change the actual story and her actual end to her life, but I tried. And so that's kind of where the main character, Thomas, who is the Queen's Almoner, that he was kind of born out of that imagination of she had somebody who could assist her in making the right decisions. And so that's where the story comes from, basically.
Thank you. I probably shouldn't admit this when I'm surrounded by people that are, as esteemed writers as you are, but I had to look up almoner. But of course, like it's from the whole idea of giving alms, right? So an almoner is somebody that is in charge of redistributing some money out to the poor.
Yes.
Okay. Right.
This takes place during a really turbulent time in Scottish history and Europe in general, just with the Reformation that swept Europe during that time period. And so that's kind of why I chose that occupation for the main character, because that was such a big part in her downfall. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And let's now go to Jenny Geiger, who I find to be a personal inspiration. Jenny's been telling stories her entire life. And if I understand correctly, like people around her have noticed her talents and have been prodding her to write things down for a long time. But she lived like a regular life and had a career and raised a family, has several daughters, has 8 grandchildren, has 2 great-grandchildren, and decided, well, now's the time. And so in pretty short order has put out 2 books and I think has some other things in the works. But she's here today to talk to us about her second book called Patmos. So if you wouldn't mind showing it off and telling us a little about that, Jennifer.
Thank you, Michelle. This is the book, and it's a spinoff on the first book. It's sort of like a spinoff, not really. You can read the first book by itself as a standalone, but the second one was written to attach to it. And it's a story of John the Apostle, who was the disciple Jesus loved, after he was banished to the island called Patmos because of his faith in Christ. And in this story, you will walk in John's shoes and see and imagine what he would have been going through when he was on this island. You will see him meet the natives of the island and how he makes friends and how he's always preaching the gospel, trying to, bring people to salvation. He also, while he's on this island, receives the revelation from God. And I put that throughout the book so that people will be able to see what happened to him as he enters the island. And then at the end of the island, when he leaves and goes back to Ephesus, where he came from, that he continues his life at preaching the gospel to anyone who would listen.
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Let's move on now to Tanya Mitchell, joining us, I think, from the Cincinnati area today. Tanya has a degree in journalism and has published and won awards publishing short fiction before, but she is here to talk about her debut novel. And it's like about time, because as I read, Tanya told her mom when she was a wee 8 years old, "Mom, someday I'm going to write a book." So she must be quite proud of your accomplishments. And so why don't you show us A Feigned Madness and tell us a little bit about your book?
Thanks, Michelle. The book is called A Feigned Madness, and the main character is a woman who goes by the pen name of Nellie Bly. It takes place in the 1880s, most of it in New York City. She desperately wants, and she's very young, she's only in her early 20s, to break into the world, I should say the man's world of journalism. She wants to be a reporter. And in the 1880s, it was generally understood that women just weren't suited for that kind of work. So nevertheless, by some very tenacious things, and I won't spoil how she does it, she's able to get hired on as a reporter in Pittsburgh. And she does so well there that within a year, she has her own column and her own following of women who very fervently are excited about the kind of reporting that she's doing. When she begins there, they begin to say, you know what, you really just need to write about women's topics. You know, you need to write about fashion and theater, but that was basically it. But she said, no, I want to write about things that women really want to know about. I want to take risks and go into factories and talk about women who are trying to afford their families, who have young children and perhaps their husband died and they're trying to make a living, those types of things. So she actually does a great job in Pittsburgh, but her next goal is to go to New York City. She wants to make it in the big time, because at that time, as now, this is where some of the biggest newspapers in the world are. So she ends up going to New York City. She goes with her mother, whom she's supporting. And she's told slowly over the next several months, because it's very difficult for her to get audiences with these high up editors, that they won't hire her because she's a woman. They don't care what kind of success that she might have had in Pittsburgh. It doesn't matter to them. She's a woman and they're not interested. So after a fatal event, almost fatal event, where she ends up losing her purse on one of New York's elevated trains, and it has the last of her money in it, she's broke. But she doesn't want to go back to Pittsburgh because she thinks it's going to be very much like failure. And so she's now desperate. And so she goes to the one editor who is head of the newspaper that she most wants to work for, which is Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. And she strikes a deal with him. It's a very dangerous deal, and she knows it, but she wants to do it anyway. So what she decides to do, and what he agrees to, is that she will feign insanity, go inside a women's insane asylum off the coast of Manhattan on Blackwell's Island, and endure for 10 days. And then when the paper pulls her out of there, she will write an expose of what happened. And as you can imagine, in the 1880s, there was so much about mental illness that was misunderstood. It was more about incarceration than it was about rehabilitation. And she knew it was going to be grim when she went in, because there had been rumors of a lot of mistreatment there on the island. But she doesn't really know how bad it is until she's there. And once she's there, of course, she's stuck there for 10 days. So the book is about those 10 days, how she gets in, what happens when she's there, and a lot of things that happen when she gets out, because there's quite a bit that happens when her story breaks.
Oh, Tanya, thank you very much for sharing. That sounds fascinating, really. Okay, and so last but certainly not least is Salvador Scabona. And I've got to say, I was reading about Salvador, and I think he once wrote that he did his best to flunk out of high school, but that reading spoke to him. And are we ever grateful and fortunate that it did? I'm really proud to introduce him because way back in the day, Salvatore won the Walter Rumsey Marvin Grant. This is an award that the Ohioana gives out every year to an aspiring author of promise under the age of 30 who has not yet published a book. And Salvatore was right on the cusp of what was going to become a really important literary career. And Ohioana likes to think, well, we helped discover him. But he went on to write now 2 novels to enormous acclaim. He's going to talk to us today about his second novel, The Volunteer. But among many other achievements, Salvatore is the winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Pushcart Prize. He was named by the New Yorker as one of its 20 under 40 fiction writers. And hot off the press, I think less than 2 weeks ago, Salvatore was awarded the top literature award by the American Academy of Arts and Letters to fulfillment of his accomplishments. So it is with great pleasure I introduce you, Salvatore. And if you wouldn't mind telling us about your second book, The Volunteer.
I'm happy to. This is here it is. It's I could start with the way there are about 2 pages at the beginning that are vaguely autobiographical, but only very vaguely. And it was about 12 years ago or so. I was in a German airport with about 7 or 8 euros in my pocket, and I was staying in Riga, Latvia at the time. but I had visited Germany for a few days, and I have this pet peeve of I hate having foreign currency in my pocket that I can't use. And when I used to um, I used to drive a lot back and forth across the Canadian border, and I would stop at the gas station and spend like, $1.33 in gas to fill it up. Anyway, I had this in mind. Still, you're wasting time in an airport, and I thought, oh well, I'm gonna see how much it costs to buy a martini on this plane. Maybe I can get maybe it's like an $8 martini, and I got in line to wait for them for the at the ticket counter. And this is a plane that was going from Hamburg to Riga. And as I was in line, there was a child crying. And this woman from the airport was from Lufthansa, it looked like, was sort of bent down and talking to him, and his mother was talking to him, and they were trying to calm him down. And then the line was forever. And then I went, as it proceeded, the mother went and sat down in the bank of chairs and started talking to the man that she was with. And I realized that wasn't the mother. So there's the kid only with the woman from the airport. And then after a while, she took him away. The line still took another 15 or 20 minutes. I had nothing to do. But the kid had cried at this, like, not this level, but like right here, as though he was trying to hold on to his resources. And, in the back of your mind, what you're thinking is trivial things. You are also thinking of very important things. And there was a part of me that had started to admire his restraint, because he was clearly very upset about something. And when I got to the front of the line, I asked the guy, how much does it cost to buy a martini on this plane? And he said, I don't know. And I said, you don't have any idea? And he said, I don't work for this airport. This airline. This is like one flight from Air Baltic that goes into this airport. I said, you really have no idea? And he said, no, I don't have any. I work for the airport. And I said, what was the matter with that kid? And just as I said that, the woman came around the corner holding this boy's hand, and he was crying at exactly the same pitch, and he had kept it up for 30 minutes. And the guy said, nobody can tell what language she's speaking. And that was when I woke from my gin hungering trance, sort of look around, and I realized that everybody else who was waiting understood what had happened, and people were completely transfixed. Someone had left this kid in the airport. And I eventually tried to help, walked him down with the woman, walked him down the airline hallway, and then all of the mechanisms of the airport were going there in different languages, saying, at this gate there is a child, come get your child. But then it became quite clear that no parent was forthcoming, and I went all the way to the end of the line, to the secure area. They went through the gates, the doors, and I never saw him again. When I got on the plane, everybody, as soon as the fasten seatbelt light was off, people got up, and people were just, there's a small plane, everybody was trading what they knew. And it was clear that we were all kind of trapped with this, a kind of trauma, really, to know information like that. And I had already been working on a book for quite a while, for a little while. And when I got back to Riga, from there was another 8 years. I needed to figure out who had left him there and how that person had come to be the kind of person who could do that. The answer in my mind was that his father had left him there, who was an Iraq War veteran. But how did the father get like that? And the father had gotten like that in part over the next 400 pages by being raised by the main character of the book, who is the volunteer, who is a veteran of Vietnam, who through a lot of twists and turns makes it his mission in life to disappear out of a kind of radical Midwestern modesty. but the consequences of that kind of behavior on other people are pretty devastating. So.
Well, that I can tell you're all storytellers, because as you all told your stories about the book, like we all leaned in to hear a little bit more from each of the authors. So, so that's great. I guess that's, you know, what makes somebody a professional writer. I want to focus a little bit more on specifically the historical fiction part of what you're doing. So the idea that this is, you know, part of what is in these books really happened. And how does that get woven in together with a creative idea? And I'd like to just go like historically, and Jennifer, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. We'll go back to biblical times and start with you. And if you could just talk a little bit about what was the research like? And did you do the research and then sit down and start writing the book? Or is it something that's a simultaneous process? What is that like for you?
Well, for me, it started when I was very young. I told stories, like I had said earlier, and instead, at that time, there was not computers. So mostly everything was just something I kept in my head. When computers came out, I started writing little things down on computers. And it was more for my own viewing, not as a thought to share as a book. So my research would be involved in the fact that over the years, I studied the Bible a lot. I love Bible history. I like history, but I particularly like Bible history. So my research came from the Bible. My research came from looking on the internet at different things. It came from different scholars that I have followed over the years, from papers I've seen others write, from books and such. And that's how I used my history. The reason I wanted to write way back then is because the Bible is accurate in its inherent word of God. And I wanted to take it and I wanted to put words to the pictures to the words. I wanted people to visualize that this was a real event, and to imagine that if you were walking across the sand, you would feel the sand seeping into your sandals, maybe the rocks at the bottom of a pathway getting into your shoes, and how the air would go through your hair and it would move it around, perhaps seeing fish jumping off the Lake of Galilee, and seeing the people that were fishing pull in their haul, bringing nets and such. I wanted to put words and pictures together so that you would feel like you were actually there watching what happened at that time, and make it more live and more believable for the reader.
So it sounds like your research was maybe the culmination of, you know, things that you had been studying in a religious way for many years in your own life.
Right.
How about you, Tanya Brown? Let's fast forward to 16th century Scotland. What was the research like for you? And you know, did you know a lot about that era before you sat down and, you know, put some words on the page?
I can kind of relate to what Jennifer was saying, as far as it didn't really start with an intention of writing the story. It began with just an interest in that character, in that time period. And as I read the story of Mary Stuart, like I had said before, she just had such a tragic life. And because she was such a controversial person in history, as I studied her and researched her life, I just started imagining what it would have been like for her to have somebody that could have possibly helped her. So when I started out researching her and reading about her, it was not with the intention to write a book. It was kind of inspired from that reading of her life story. And so that's kind of how the book came to be. So a lot of research did go into it before I started writing. Certainly not the end of it. As I write, there has to be, a lot of times I'll have to stop and say, okay, I'm not really sure what happened in this point in her life. I'll have to stop what I'm doing and go back and research more. And then of course comes the whole aspect of the life, the culture, what it was like in the 16th century. A lot of research went into that. And sometimes I didn't realize how much I didn't know until I try to write it and describe it and realize, okay, I don't really know a lot about this particular time period, or about, you know, how they would prepare certain foods, what kinds of foods were available, what kind of clothing they would wear, just those simple little things that really make the story come alive to the reader. And so I would have to stop writing and go back and do more research. So it was really a continuous process, even though the majority of the research was done before I started writing. But yeah, it's definitely a process that continues throughout the writing process.
It's so interesting to hear that you would start writing about a scene, for example, we want to have a big banquet, and then you'd have to say, I'm not sure what they ate. And then,
Yeah.
you know, off you go to the library or on the internet now. So
And I'm kind of a stickler about historical things like that. When I'm reading historical fiction, my mind tends to go to that couldn't have happened because that item wasn't invented yet, or just little things like that that kind of stick out to me. And so I'm a little bit of a stickler when it comes to writing that, because I don't want other people to be able to say, well, that's wrong, she didn't do her research, because you know, you can't put potatoes on a 14th century plate in Europe because they weren't discovered yet. You know, just little things like that. You know, they didn't have potatoes in Europe in the 14th century. Just things like that that really kind of I don't know, make the story more authentic. So
well, sticking with our theme of like fast forward, now let's go to Ohio, right? And because I think 1837 sticks out in Pete's book, in your book, Pete. And so your book is a little farcical. How much did you feel that it was important to stick with the history of the time, and what was your research like? You're on mute, Pete.
Time-honored tradition that I start talking without unmuting myself. So I've blessed the chat with that. I was actually pretty, even though the book I think maybe wears its history a little bit lighter, it came from a deep and pretty long fascination with 19th century history. I think the 19th century Ohio and the 19th century Midwest, particularly the first half of it, is kind of this really wild, like lost patch of America, where, you know, we talk about the Civil War as this big sort of national wound that hasn't been healed, and we talk about the Gilded Era, and but we don't really talk that much about what happened in between, say, 1815 and 1850 very much. I, like Tanya Brown, really wanted to make sure I didn't do anything that just wasn't like, you know, I didn't want to have people using matches, for instance, if matches weren't commercially available. And I found out that they were. They showed up sort of in the early 1830s. More important to me, though, is I really wanted to get the language right. I mean, because books are language, they're acts of language. And a quote that kept popping back into my head is the very first line of a novel by L.P. Hartley, which is, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." And the way I wanted to, I guess, you know, I'm fully aware of the fact that, you know, there is no real 1837. We can't experience it. So I wanted to listen to what the voices of 1837 sounded like. And I did that through rereading the newspaper holdings at the Western Reserve Historical Society. That was the best way to get a sense of what the sound of 1837 Cleveland talking to itself was. That was a great way to find language. And then I sort of borrowed from things that I liked that maybe weren't strictly speaking like canon. That, you know, it's not 1837 Ohio, but it was something from that time period. And the really big documents for me were these books called the Crockett Almanacs, which were about Davy Crockett. And Davy Crockett is actually a really illustrative or sort of great case in point for historical fiction, because he essentially wrote fan fiction about himself, or authorized people to write fan fiction about himself, even while he was still alive, before he died at the Alamo. These books called Crockett Almanacs emerged that had sort of written in this very silly vernacular tone that probably had very little to do with what Davy Crockett actually sounded like, emerged. No one really knows who wrote them. They're unsigned, or they're written by Davy Crockett. And they kept going after he died. So clearly he was not the responsible party. And so looking at them and the way they talked in this sort of deeply idiosyncratic but loving relationship that people in the 1830s had with standard English grammar. They couldn't deal with it. And they really kind of perverted it in spectacular ways. So I wanted to get that feel into my book too. And most importantly, I just didn't want to get stuff like you can find out what phase of the moon it was on X date in 1837. So I did, because like it's cool to get it right. And I did a lot of what Tanya talked about. It's just like I would hit something of like, I got to figure this out. So go learn it, come back, and then start writing, especially towards the beginning of the process. And then the only other thing I did, just because I'm uptight, is like every time I used a word that I don't think I used before, I just looked it up in the OED to make sure there was a usage that was 1837 or earlier.
Wow, that's really interesting to hear. And like at first blush, a novel like you've published, I don't know that the reader would necessarily appreciate that you took that much care, because there's so many other big things going on in that novel that it's, I'm really happy that you were able to share that detail. Did you look up the phase of the moon because you already knew you wanted to talk about the phase of the moon, or were you just obsessing then?
No, I mean, if there was a date in my story, if I knew something was happening on July 4th, 1837, and I was describing that night, I should be able to say like it was a, I wasn't going to say it's waxing gibbous or, whatever, but just say like, I don't want to say like, oh, we went without lanterns because the moon was full, if in fact there was no moon that night, or it was a new moon, or it was cloudy.
Tanya Mitchell. So we don't have to fast forward very long now, very quickly to 1887, right? Is the setting for your book about Nellie Bly. What was it like to do the research for that, and where were you taking liberties, all that?
Well, to go back a little bit, the seed of the book began when I was reading a blog, and I happened upon it one day, and the title was something about history's badass women or something like that. And I think the word badass in the title was enough to get me interested right away. And it was short paragraphs about these remarkable women through history who had done such awesome things. So that's where I found Nellie Bly. And, she was a journalist for most of her life. I had a journalism degree and never had her name ever been brought up in any class that I ever took. And I just couldn't believe it. So of course, I went to Wikipedia because that's sort of the first place everybody goes, right? They wanted some quick research. And I could not believe, again, how much this woman got up to. So then from there, I decided to read her own expose that she published after she got out of the asylum. And it was riveting. I loved it, but it didn't have anything in it because she had written it for a newspaper audience that was in any way personal. I still didn't know anything about her. I didn't know about her family. I knew she was young. I didn't know if she had siblings. Was she married? What kind of a life had she had? Why had she wanted to go into journalism so much? And so from there, I looked for the novel, and there wasn't one that existed. And if there was ever a tap on my shoulder from the universe, this was the book I needed to write, it was that, because 130 some years had gone by and nobody had written about her. Now people have, now that my books come out and a few others have, her story is beginning to be told. But at that time, and that was only maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it hadn't been. So I think before I started writing, I did about 80% of the research. And I wanted to make sure that I got to the small town in Pennsylvania where she was from, because I wanted to see what her ginormous childhood home was like, because she was quite young when she was small. Her father did quite well for himself. And I talked a long time to the Historical Society there and found out some more information about her. And then I went to New York City because there were still many places that were going to be in the book that I wanted to get right. And the asylum is across the river on Roosevelt Island. In Nellie's day, it was called Blackwell's Island. I went there and was absolutely fascinated by the fact that part of the asylum is still there. There was a ginormous octagonal tower that connected the wings to it. They demolished the wings back in the 70s, but they kept the tower. And just to be able to stand there and look up at it and see how big it was such a great moment, because I was basically treading on the ground that she had once tread on. There wasn't one plaque there, though, that commemorated what she had done. There is going to be, that's coming in the future this summer, because as I say, her story is getting out. But yeah, I took the 2 trips. And so then I came back and I started to write. And as Tanya and Pete were saying, I would get to a point where either the story was, the historical record was silent, or it was a little bit murky. And then I got to take some creative license. Most of it was pretty much, you know, this happened and then this happened and then this was the final end. But there was enough throughout that I was able to play with it a little bit, which was probably one of the most fun aspects of the book. And really, I think, help readers learn what she was about, because I reveal a lot more than what she ever revealed in her expose in that way.
So interesting to hear you describing like it's a relief that there's a hole in her story somewhere, so that, you know, a writer can help fill that hole and make it meaningful to readers, a lot like what Jennifer was describing. You know, we've all read the Bible, many have read the Bible, but fill in these holes for me and make it sing. Salvatore, so your book spans lots of different, like, geography, Cambodia and New York and Mexico. Like, Tanya, did you travel to those places, or how did you go about your research? Oh, you're on mute too.
Sorry, I did travel quite a lot. But research is more, I wouldn't say that the research is more important, but it was at least as important, I think, as travel was. Almost the entire book takes place outside of my own experience, and that's, you know, that's an important thing for me. I think it's an interesting current that's going on in our conversation about why fiction writers are interested in accuracy. When I first published a part of this book in the New Yorker, and the fact checker at the time came back through my editor and said, there are no smoking lounges in the Hamburg airport in that terminal. And some of my friends said, like, that's ridiculous. Like, they don't get to, you can make this up. You're allowed to make this up. And I said, no, wait. The fact checker said, we checked, and there are smoking cabins. And in fact, which is when I remembered, yeah, that's right. There are these, like, awful plexiglass boxes in the hallway, so that if you are going to smoke, you're crammed into these chambers of shame. And I just was so grateful for that word, a smoking cabin. And it just makes me think that, you know, there's a lot of the book takes place in a very large part takes place in Vietnam, and around the Tet Offensive especially, and then in the tunnels that the Viet Cong dug throughout South Vietnam, and then in the book into Cambodia in part. I guess the thing that interests me about this is that there's the motivation that comes from getting it right, which is fun, but then there's this other motivation that comes from, like, the charisma of fact. When you, I mean, I can imagine Pete having arrived found that, like, on a particular night, having imagined all manner of other things, to know that you could put a pin of actual reality in the middle of the thing that you made up, and it's as though new life accumulates or is, like, magnetized by something that you're sure is really true. It's I know it's very woo-woo, but it maybe part of the sort of sex appeal of fact in that regard is that you are dwelling in so much uncertainty about the value of what you're doing, that when you introduce something that you're sure is fact, the value of it in some way stops being questionable, and you've got something to hold on to. and you'll it's a little, it's as though you're like flailing around in the ocean, and you know, the coffin comes up and you're Ishmael and you grab onto the coffin. There's something that's hard and floating that's real, and you'll do anything to hold on to that real thing.
Like it becomes a comfort in what's an uncomfortable experience of writing something out of whole cloth.
It feels more, well, I mean, sometimes it's comforting, but sometimes it's really like in some way it's life-saving, because there's like, there will be some auratic quality. Like for example, it occurred to me in the middle of my, I have these two characters who are kept prisoners in a tunnel in Cambodia. One of them loves that story about Jennifer, about John of Patmos eating the book, and how it was bitter in his mouth, or sweet in his mouth, and is it bitter in his stomach when it goes down? And you know, I just I love thinking about that the person would know that, and then it was like, what is going on actually with his hands while he's talking about this? And I wanted him to be playing with a carburetor, but then I had to figure out exactly what kind of carburetor would be available to, like, in a junk heap underground in 1969. You know, we're all, you know, I think all five of us are junkies for that kind of information. Sounds like.
Wow. The other thing that struck me was, you know, I know that a lot of your book, Salvatore, is based on, you know, fact and his historical fiction. One thing that I thought for sure hadn't really happened was the scene in the airport. And yet that, not only did that happen, that was like the kernel that got you going.
That's the only thing that really happened.
Okay, I see. Well, a lot of people will be watching this panel because they are also aspiring authors. So I wondered if we could have you go around, and if you wouldn't mind generously providing just a little bit of wisdom to people that might be interested in this genre, and, you know, whether they'd have a chance to have a crack at it. Pete, do you want to start us off? And what do you tell your students?
You know, the only I think piece of writing advice that I don't feel like I'm lying a little bit when I tell people is like, all you can do is show up and put your butt in the chair and try. And if you don't do that, I guarantee you nothing's going to happen. But if you do that, at least maybe you got a fighting chance. But for me personally, there's a great line in Stephen King's On Writing, where he says, if you want to be a successful writer, you kind of have to give up on being a normal person, which it's one of those great lines, because like I can find myself arguing with it, which is like, I like being normal. I have a wife, and, you know, and she's pregnant. We have a house and cats and stuff. Like I want to feed them and be present in their lives. And then another part of me wants to just be like sort of this ogre who lives up in this attic with a laptop and just sort of tries to write. I think you can kind of split the difference and do both, but you do kind of have to surrender to, just speaking from my experience as a guy who's finished exactly one book, that I just had to surrender to it. I bought a junky used laptop and I ripped the Wi-Fi card out, and I just said, I'm doing this for at least 2 hours every day until I have a book.
Jennifer, does that ring true to you, or what's been your secret?
I think the best thing I can tell somebody is, if you have a thought or something that you really like, something that's your passion, that it's easy to write about it. You just put yourself in the place of the writer or the event that you're thinking about, and you sit down and you write. And sometimes I carry a notepad with me, like if I'm out somewhere and if I get a thought, I write it down. I keep it with me. And if I have a thought of, sometimes I'm just writing in the car and maybe I'm thinking of a scene I wrote, and I've put some thoughts down because I'm going to remember that later. And I just think like Pete says, you sit down and you write on what you love and what you think about. And it just for me, it just flows from the pen to the computer.
Tanya Mitchell, when Jennifer was just talking about like having a passion about something, it reminded me of how you described your book, that something about that story just really struck you and it seemed like the one you should write. Is that what you think other people should be looking for, like the one big passion, or what would be your advice?
I think it certainly helps. I would say my biggest advice would be to do it now. Don't put it off. When I look back, I wish that I had started earlier, like when I was in my 20s. But back then I thought, well, I needed to have, a promotion, and then, but inevitably things like marriage and kids and things like that, all that can get in the way of writing. But like Pete was saying, you just have to surrender to writing itself and just get it done. Don't wait until life is perfect, because you know what? Life is never going to be perfect. We always have so many different responsibilities that are going to be pulling us in different directions. You have to, at some point, prioritize the work itself. And that's how a book gets done. And it's not just the first one. I mean, I'm sure Salvador can say the same thing. It's the next book and the next book after that.
Tanya Brown, what would you tell your fourth grade students who might be aspiring someday to write?
Well, I think my biggest piece of advice would just be to just do it and be consistent with it. It's really easy to get bogged down with the big picture and this big book that you imagine yourself writing, and it can become overwhelming really quickly. So I think if you just decide that you're going to write a little bit every day, and maybe not even every day, but just try to be consistent with it, and it eventually it gets done, and you can look back and you just kind of have to wow, that you can't believe that you actually accomplished it, because it did take little steps day by day to get that accomplished. And so my biggest piece of advice, I think, would just be to just be consistent with it and do a little bit when you can, and not, for me, it took me years to get this first book written, because I wasn't real serious about it. It was just kind of a fun thing to do when I was in grad school as a distraction. And I did look at that bigger picture and think, I'm never going to get this done. But when I started getting consistent with it and sticking with it and deciding, okay, I'm going to write a little bit every day, then, eventually you look back and it's done. And so, yeah.
Do you write during the school year as well, or do you like really lean into that summer break?
Yeah, I do try to write. I try to write every day. I mean, there are things that come up that, are priorities. Most of us probably do have families and children and other responsibilities. And with me, I know personally, I have a full-time job, but I do try to get a little bit of writing in. And I find that I do have times where I'm just mentally, I have a block, or I'm just not feeling it. And so I find that when I try to force myself, I'm not very productive when I do that. So, but if I do try to just do a little bit when I can, and yeah, so.
Thank you. Salvatore, what advice can you offer? Now you've just muted yourself.
You're asking specifically about writing from history in some way. Something that one very specific thing. My first book was set just a few miles to the east of Pete's book, and it was set in a fictionalized version of the Murray Hill neighborhood in Cleveland, and I really started getting obsessive about wanting to know, like, could I refer to the bishop? Say, if I know there's one bishop, and I mean, this is a matter of fact, it's a matter of discoverable fact. Can I make that up? And so I decided that I needed to have a frontier of fictionality. And that meant, in effect, that in my mind, and actually, and on my bulletin board, there was like a map. Within the map, any arrangement of streets was free for me to make up. Once I passed over a certain street, it had to be situated in such that the distances had to match real reality. And I bring that up only because all fiction writers do that in some form. Very few people are going to write like a beautiful novel, the novel Libro by Don DeLillo, which is one of the great masterpieces in contemporary American writing, IMHO. he at in one version of it, he says, I have contradicted none of the facts as I know them. That's one particular version of making the frontier. But like, he doesn't, for example, refer to um, John Kennedy's first wife, Helen, because like that would like cross a certain kind of line for him. But a fiction writer could, of course, make a novel that is about that kind of thing. The question is just where you draw it, how you draw it, and how consistently you draw it. He draws it so consistently that he can go directly into the thoughts of Lee Harvey Oswald in a way that is completely persuasive, and yet there's no way that's historical fact, right? He doesn't have access to the mind of this man who had no public life up to that point. And every one of us on this panel is in some way making a negotiation with fact in that way. If we are too constrained by fact, then I think effectively we denigrate the value of imagination, which has been a real problem, I think, culturally for many of us in recent years, where the news has been so urgent and so important to so many people that it can seem as though, the piece of fiction that you're writing kind of can't hold up as an urgent matter. And it does. It's obviously the life of the imagination is really important. So anyway, I just think that writing in the past is in some way a way of kind of engaging the imagination with fact, rather than having imagination be in one place and the political realities, moral urgency of the moment right now, it can't override the importance of the inner life.
How interesting to listen to that, because as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about fake news and, the reality of our past several years, in our political lives right now. And yet we're listening to fiction authors who are obsessing over the details of actual fact. It seems somehow a little topsy-turvy or upside down, that this is the place that we have to go to figure out the real deal. But it's beautiful. Thank you all for sharing all that information about your process, because I think those of us that are not historical fiction writers, really it's hard to imagine how much blood, sweat, and tears goes into producing a piece of good work like that. So what a pleasure to hear about it. Well, I just, I knew that the time was going to fly. I look at my clock and can't believe an hour has passed, but what an absolute pleasure to have been with all of you today. So to Pete Beatty, Jennifer Geiger, Tanya Brown, Tanya Mitchell, Salvador Scabona, I thank you so much for giving up your time. And on behalf of readers, especially in this year of pandemic, where I believe, one good thing that's come of this is that we've all read maybe more than we ever did before, and that is a blessing. So on behalf of readers in this particular year, I thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Bye.